What if the woman who defined the supermodel era was hiding secrets that could shake Hollywood? What if behind the flawless photographs, the runway lights, and the billboards that lit up Times Square, there was a private story of love, heartbreak, and whispered affairs that the world was never supposed to know? To understand the magnetism of Cindy Crawford's love life, you first need to understand what the early 1990s looked like. This was a decade of excess, of spectacle, of pop culture at its most glamorous. Fashion shows weren't just fashion shows anymore. They were global events. Covers of Vogue and Harper's Bazaar could launch careers overnight. And at the center of it all stood 6 women who were more than just models. They were supermodels. Naomi Campbell, Linda Evangelista, Christy Turlington, Claudia Schiffer, Kate Moss, and Cindy Crawford. Each of them had their own magic, their own calling card. Naomi had the walk that could silence a room. Linda had the chameleon-like ability to transform into anyone. Christy was serene, statuesque, almost regal. Claudia brought German precision and blonde bombshell energy. Kate was a waif, the anti-model, skinny and fragile at a time when curves still reigned. But Cindy was different. She wasn't just beautiful, she was approachable. Her beauty mark above her lip became as iconic as Marilyn Monroe's. She looked like the girl next door, but a version sculpted by the gods. She had a warmth that cameras loved, a charisma that made her stand out even when surrounded by the most beautiful women in the world. When Cindy Crawford walked into a room, she didn't just take attention, she owned it. By the time the 90s hit, Cindy was already everywhere. On magazine covers, on television hosting MTV's House of Style, in commercials like a legendary 1992 Pepsi ad, where she stepped out of a sports car and made the world stop. Cindy wasn't just modeling fashion. She was modeling an entire era of aspiration. She embodied what glamour looked like, what success looked like, what the dream of the 90s looked like. But with that kind of fame comes another kind of spotlight, one that digs deeper, one that asks questions not about what you're wearing, but about who you're loving. Cindy's romances and friendships became as much a part of a mythology as her runway walks. The tabloids, always hungry for stories, latched on. And soon, Cindy Crawford's love life wasn't just her own. It belonged to the public imagination. Her marriage to actor Richard Gere was the stuff of fairy tales. The most famous supermodel in the world tying the knot with one of Hollywood's most handsome leading men. Together, they were the couple that magazines couldn't print enough of, the couple fans believed in as proof that beauty and fame could merge into something resembling perfection. Yet, even that golden love story didn't last. Then came Rande Gerber, the man who would become Cindy's anchor, her partner through decades, and the father of her children. With him, the story shifted from spectacle to stability, from fleeting romance to long-lasting empire building. But while her marriage with Gerber gave her a foundation, the whispers that followed Cindy told a different kind of story. Because for every confirmed romance, there was a rumor. For every wedding ring, there was speculation about forbidden affairs. Some of the whispers involved women, an idea that in the early 90s was explosive, scandalous, and endlessly fascinating to the press. There was a 1993 Vanity Fair cover shoot with Canadian singer K.D. Lang, an image that blurred the line between fashion and intimacy, sparking rumors of something more between the model and the musician. The photograph alone became one of the most provocative cultural moments of the decade. Then there was Madonna, the queen of controversy herself, whose friendship with Cindy in the early 90s fueled headlines about late-night trysts, secret flings, and a kind of passion that could never be confirmed but never quite denied either. Together, these stories, some true, some speculative, created a legend around Cindy Crawford. A legend that wasn't just about beauty, but about desire, mystery, and the secret life behind the camera. And that's the story we're diving into today. From Richard Gere's Hollywood glow to Rande Gerber's enduring love, from the iconic Vanity Fair cover with K.D. Lang to the swirling Madonna rumors, this is the untold history of Cindy Crawford's secret love life, a story where the truth and the rumor mill are forever intertwined. Cindy Crawford's story doesn't begin under the bright lights of Paris or Milan, nor in the glitzy chaos of Los Angeles or New York. It begins in DeKalb, Illinois, a small Midwestern town known more for its cornfields and catwalks. Born in 1966, Cindy grew up far removed from a world she would one day conquer. She was the second of 4 children in a working-class family, with her father working as an electrician and her mother as a bank teller. Life in DeKalb was ordinary, school, chores, and a kind of grounded simplicity that would always cling to Cindy, even after she became one of the most famous faces on Earth. At the age of 16, her world shifted when a local newspaper photographer spotted her and snapped a picture. That photo set off whispers in her hometown about her striking beauty. Soon after, she entered modeling competitions, including one organized by elite model management. Although she didn't win the contest, she caught the attention of the industry. Elite signed her, and before long, the girl from DeKalb was thrust into the orbit of fashion's biggest stages. What set Cindy apart from other rising models wasn't just her looks, though her beauty was undeniable. It was the way she balanced glamour with approachability. Her famous beauty mark, the mole just above her upper lip, wasn't something she hid. In fact, it became her trademark. In a modeling industry obsessed with perfection, that tiny detail made her distinctive. She wasn't flawless in the cold, distant way some models are presented. She was relatable. She was the kind of woman people admired but also felt they could know. This combination of goddess and girl next door created a unique magnetism. Cindy didn't intimidate her audience. She invited them in. Designers, photographers, and brands noticed. By the late 1980s, she was already working with legends like Richard Gere and Herberts, appearing on the covers of major magazines. As the 1990s dawned, Cindy was no longer just a successful model. She was becoming a phenomenon. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. The early 90s marked the explosion of the supermodel era, a cultural moment when models became celebrities in their own right, standing shoulder to shoulder with Hollywood actors and pop stars. Alongside Naomi Campbell, Linda Evangelista, Christy Turlington, Claudia Schiffer, and later Kate Moss, Cindy was part of the Big Six who redefined the meaning of fame in fashion. These women weren't just faces in magazines. They were icons, booked for music videos, television appearances, and endorsement deals worth millions. And Cindy wasn't content to stay on the runway. In 1989, she began hosting MTV's House of Style, a program that mixed fashion, pop culture, and celebrity interviews. At first glance, it seemed like just another cable show, but in reality, it was revolutionary. Cindy's warm, natural personality shone through as she guided viewers behind the scenes of fashion shows, introduced designers, and chatted with other models. Suddenly, the fashion world, which had always seemed distant and elitist, felt accessible. Teenagers in Middle America could watch MTV and feel like they had a window into the glamorous lives of supermodels. And Cindy wasn't just a host. She was the face of it all. House of Style turned her from model to media personality, deepening her connection with audiences far beyond the pages of Vogue. Her influence wasn't limited to fashion television. Cindy also became the star of some of the most unforgettable commercials of the decade. The most iconic came in 1992 during the Super Bowl, the Pepsi ad. Cindy steps out of a red Lamborghini in a white tank top and cut-off denim shorts, walks toward a vending machine, and cracks open an ice-cold can of Pepsi. Two young boys watch in awe as the moment unfolds. The ad was simple, but it became legendary. Cindy Crawford drinking a Pepsi was no longer just a commercial. It was a pop culture event. That 30-second spot cemented her status as a household name, an image replayed endlessly and remembered decades later. Revlon, too, made her one of their signature faces. Her ad campaigns weren't just about selling lipstick or mascara. They were about selling the idea of confidence, power, and timeless beauty. Cindy's presence in commercials wasn't accidental. Brands understood that she had a crossover appeal that other models lacked. She wasn't just for the fashion elite. She was for everyone. By the early 90s, Cindy Crawford was no longer simply a model. She was a brand. She had conquered runways, magazine covers, television, and advertising. She was everywhere, and everyone knew her name. To the public, she represented not just beauty, but an entire era of aspiration. And with that kind of fame came another layer of obsession. People wanted to know not only what Cindy was wearing, but who she was with. Her personal life became inseparable from her public persona. Every boyfriend, every friendship, every rumor was magnified under the paparazzi's flashbulbs. When she eventually married Richard Gere, it wasn't just a private union. It was a global spectacle. Cindy's rise from a small-town girl in Illinois to the world's most famous supermodel set the perfect stage for her love life to become one of Hollywood's greatest fascinations. Because when someone becomes that iconic, Every romance, every rumor, every secret isn't just personal. It becomes part of their legend. And Cindy's legend was only just beginning. By the time Cindy Crawford entered the orbit of Richard Gere, he wasn't just an actor. He was one of Hollywood's defining sex symbols. Gere had exploded into public consciousness in the early 1980s with American Gigolo, strutting across the screen with a mix of vulnerability and raw sexuality that made him both a heartthrob and an enigma. The image of Gere, tanned and confident, slipping into Armani suits, became an emblem of a decade obsessed with excess and allure. A decade later, Pretty Woman would cement his place in pop culture. Starring opposite Julia Roberts in the 1990 romantic fairytale, Gere was no longer just a mysterious leading man. He became the ultimate romantic fantasy, the silver-haired businessman capable of rescuing and being rescued by love. Cindy Crawford, meanwhile, was in the midst of her own ascension. By the late 80s, her face was plastered across magazine covers, and her Pepsi commercial was about to become one of the most replayed ads in history. She was the epitome of the new supermodel era, glamorous yet approachable, chic yet relatable. When their worlds collided, it was as if two celestial bodies of different orbits suddenly aligned. Hollywood had its golden couple, and the world couldn't look away. The two reportedly met at a star-studded party in the late 80s. Gere, already in his late 30s, exuded a calm, meditative charisma. He was famously interested in Buddhism and spirituality, and his presence often felt grounded and mature. Cindy, on the other hand, was in her early 20s, still riding the rocket of her meteoric rise. What began as a flirtation quickly evolved into romance, though the age gap, 17 years, raised eyebrows from beginning. Still, in the rarefied air of Hollywood, where unlikely pairings were practically expected, their connection seemed undeniable. Their relationship didn't just capture attention, it consumed it. Paparazzi shots of them together, Cindy in her effortlessly chic off-duty looks, Gere with his movie star cool, became fixtures in tabloids and glossy magazines. For the public, it was as if a supermodel and a movie god had stepped out of the screen and into reality. Then came the wedding, and it was nothing like the grand, over-the-top event everyone imagined. In December 1991, Cindy Crawford and Richard Gere shocked the world by tying the knot in Las Vegas. Instead of a lavish Beverly Hills celebration, they opted for the Little Church of the West, a modest wedding chapel on the Strip. There were no elaborate gowns, no celebrity guest lists stretching into the hundreds. In fact, the couple exchanged vows in jeans, making the moment all the more surprising. The spontaneity of it all, two of the most glamorous people in the world, suddenly stripping everything down to a private, intimate ceremony, only added to the myth. The image of them, newly married, exiting the chapel in denim, was etched into Hollywood's memory. To fans, it signaled something authentic, a reminder that behind the lights and cameras, these two megastars were still capable of something simple and human. To tabloids, it was catnip, the story of a glamorous couple choosing humility over extravagance. The coverage was relentless, and for a while, the Gere-Crawford marriage was sold as a perfect pairing, beauty and maturity, fashion and film, glamour and groundedness. But perfection has cracks, and theirs began to show almost immediately. Beneath the glow of their public image, Cindy and Richard were struggling with realities that were harder to gloss over in magazine spreads. Their age gap wasn't just a number. It reflected different stages of life. Gere was a seasoned actor with decades of experience behind him, often seeking a quiet existence, while Cindy was still discovering herself in the whirlwind of fame, just beginning to define her identity beyond modeling. Cindy would later reflect candidly on those years, admitting that she often felt like a kid in the relationship. She was just 25 when they married, while Gere was 42, and those 17 years created a gap not only in age but in perspective. In interviews years later, Cindy described how she had been so focused on pleasing him, on fitting into his world, that she didn't yet know who she truly was. The marriage, in hindsight, was a lesson in the dangers of trying to merge two lives before fully understanding your own. Still, at the time, few outside their inner circle suspected trouble. In public, they continued to shine as Hollywood's golden couple, gracing red carpets, charity galas, and magazine covers. But by 1994, whispers of trouble began to seep into press. There were rumors of distance, of incompatible lifestyles, of a relationship stretched too thin by careers lived on different continents and in different headspaces. By 1995, it was over. Their divorce was announced with a kind of shock reserved for endings that the public simply didn't want to believe. For many, Cindy and Richard had been more than just a celebrity couple. They had been a fantasy, a marriage that seemed to blend beauty and substance, glamour and depth. When it dissolved, it felt symbolic, like the closing of a chapter not just for them, but for a whole cultural fantasy about what love between two icons could look like. The tabloids had a field day. Speculation swirled about what had gone wrong. Some claimed the age gap was insurmountable. Others whispered about Gere's spiritual pursuits clashing with Cindy's burgeoning career ambitions. A particularly persistent rumor that the marriage would be more of a publicity stunt than a true romance circulated, though both Cindy and Richard strongly rejected the idea. The fact that they had married so quietly and privately, without the glitz of a Hollywood spectacle, seemed to argue against that cynical theory. Years later, Cindy would address the marriage with honesty rather than regret. She didn't frame it as a mistake, but as a formative experience. She acknowledged that at the time, she hadn't fully developed her sense of self, and the relationship forced her to confront that. She described how she had been trying to mold herself into what she thought Gere wanted, rather than standing firmly in her own identity. That self-reflection painted a picture of a young woman learning, through heartbreak, that love cannot thrive if one partner hasn't yet discovered who they are. In cultural terms, the end of Cindy and Richard's marriage felt like more than just a divorce. It was symbolic of a shift in Hollywood itself. The early 90s supermodel movie star couple represented a kind of old-school glamour, the idea that two beautiful people could merge their lives into a fairy tale. By the mid-90s, though, that fantasy was unraveling. The rise of grunge, the cynicism of Generation X, and the increasing intrusion of tabloids meant that perfection was no longer believable, or even desirable. Cindy and Richard's divorce was a reminder that even the most glamorous pairings were fragile, and that Hollywood dreams often cracked under weight of reality. For Cindy, the marriage to Richard Gere would always be remembered as a defining chapter of her life, not just because of the love and heartbreak, but because it marked her transition from a young woman swept up in a fantasy to an individual who would emerge stronger, clearer, and more self-assured. For Gere, it was another layer in his mystique. The sex symbol who had captured the heart of the world's most famous supermodel, only to see it slip away. The golden couple of Hollywood had shone brilliantly, but like all golden things, their shine faded. What remained, however, was a story that continues to fascinate. The tale of two icons who seemed to embody perfection, only to remind us that even perfection has its limits. By the late 1990s, Cindy Crawford had already lived a life fuller than most people could imagine. She had conquered the runways, transformed into a cultural icon through campaigns with Pepsi and Revlon, and experienced the dizzying highs and painful lows of being married to one of Hollywood's biggest movie stars. The divorce from Richard Gere had been more than a personal loss. It had played out under the glaring spotlight of public fascination. She could have easily turned away from love, focusing solely on her career. Instead, fate brought her to someone who would transform her life in a completely different way, Rande Gerber. Rand wasn't an actor. He wasn't the kind of megastar whose every move was tracked by the tabloids. In fact, his appeal lay in the fact that he existed outside the suffocating center of Hollywood. A former model himself, Gerber understood Cindy's world. The long hours, the scrutiny, the constant pressure to look perfect. But he also had his own thriving career. By the mid-1990s, Rand had reinvented himself as a successful entrepreneur in the nightlife industry. He owned a string of fashionable bars and lounges in New York and Los Angeles, quickly earning a reputation as someone who could build experiences, not just businesses. In many ways, he embodied the shift of the decade, from the glitzy glamour of the 80s to the cooler, sleeker, business-savvy sophistication of the 90s. When Cindy met Rand, the chemistry was immediate, but so was a sense of ease. Unlike her whirlwind romance with Gere, which had swept her into a Hollywood fantasy, her connection with Gerber was rooted in friendship, laughter, and a grounded energy. There was no grand pretense, no need to mold herself into someone else's vision. With Rand, Cindy could be Cindy, the supermodel, yes, but also the girl from DeKalb, Illinois, who still craved authenticity and simplicity. Their romance blossomed quietly, without the same tabloid frenzy that had defined her first marriage. In 1998, they tied the knot, and once again Cindy rejected the Hollywood playbook of extravagant weddings. Their ceremony was private, intimate, and stripped of spectacle. If her wedding to Richard Gere had been shocking because of its Las Vegas spontaneity, her marriage to Gerber was the opposite. Carefully chosen, thoughtfully intimate, and rooted in stability. There were no headlines about denim at the altar this time. Instead, there was a sense of two people deliberately choosing each other, not for image or fantasy, but for partnership. That foundation would become the key to their longevity. While Gere and Crawford had struggled with the age gap and clashing lifestyles, Gerber and Crawford were peers. They shared not only similar backgrounds in modeling, but also a vision for life that extended beyond the red carpet. Rand wasn't competing for the spotlight, nor was he a shadow in Cindy's glow. Together, they formed a partnership where each could thrive individually while building a family and empire collectively. In 1999, Cindy and Rand welcomed their first child, Presley Gerber, and 2 years later, their daughter Kaya was born. What might have been a typical celebrity family quickly grew into something more, the making of a dynasty. Cindy, once the face of an entire generation, was now raising children who would carve their own path in modeling. Kaya, in particular, became a sensation, inheriting not only her mother's striking beauty but also her poise and charisma. Watching Kaya grace magazine covers in the 2010s felt almost like déjà vu for those who had witnessed Cindy's rise decades earlier. Presley, too, dipped into modeling, reinforcing the idea that Cindy and Rand hadn't just built a marriage. They had created a legacy. Meanwhile, Rande Gerber's business ventures expanded far beyond the nightlife industry. His most famous endeavor, of course, was co-founding Casamigos Tequila with George Clooney and Mike Meldman. What began as a private project among friends, designed to produce tequila they personally loved, exploded into one of the most successful celebrity-backed liquor brands in history. In 2017, the company was sold to Diageo in a deal worth up to $1 billion, cementing Gerber's status as more than just Cindy Crawford's husband. He was a mogul in his own right, proof that his business acumen could rival the longevity of Cindy's modeling career. Together, Cindy and Rand projected an image that felt almost radical in Hollywood: stability. While other celebrity couples rose and fell in dramatic tabloid sagas, they quietly endured. There were no scandals, no public feuds, no messy divorces splashed across magazine covers. Instead, there was a sense of calm, of two people who had built something unshakable by prioritizing partnership over performance. Why did this marriage last when her first did not? The answers are laid. With Rand, Cindy had reached a point in her life where she knew who she was. She wasn't the 25-year-old trying to mold herself into someone else's expectations. She was a global icon who had learned, sometimes painfully, the importance of self-knowledge. Rand, meanwhile, wasn't seeking to control or overshadow her identity. Their lives were complementary, not conflicting. He understood the demands of her career because he had once lived them, but he also created a world outside of it where they could retreat into normalcy. Even their public image reflected this balance. With Gere, Cindy had been half of a glamorous fantasy, a union that existed as much for the public as it did for themselves. With Rand, she was part of a narrative of endurance, of love that matured and grew alongside their shared successes. The tabloids had little to feast on, which, in its own way, became its own form of power. The absence of scandal became their brand. In time, Cindy and Rand evolved into one of Hollywood's most admired couples not because they were flashy but because they weren't. They outlasted the gossip, the constant churn of celebrity breakups, and the pressures of fame. They showed that passion and stability weren't opposites, but rather two sides of the same coin when nurtured with trust, respect, and humor. Looking back, it's almost poetic. Cindy Crawford's first marriage symbolized the end of a Hollywood fantasy, while her second became a blueprint for modern celebrity partnership. She went from being part of a golden couple to building a golden family. From the chaos of the tabloids to the quiet strength of stability, Cindy's love story with Rande Gerber isn't just about survival. It's about thriving in a world that often chews up relationships and spits them out. In a culture obsessed with scandal, Cindy and Rand proved that the real secret to longevity might not be the fireworks of passion or the spectacle of celebrity, but the steady glow of two people who choose each other again and again when no one's watching. In 1993, Cindy Crawford was already one of the most famous women in the world. She was a face of the supermodel era, a household name who had become just as recognizable as Hollywood's biggest movie stars. That year, She would take part in a photo shoot that not only shocked the fashion industry but also shook mainstream culture, a shoot that would forever tie her name to one of the boldest and most provocative cultural statements of the decade. It all started with a cover for Vanity Fair. At the time, the magazine was known for pushing boundaries, but few could have anticipated just how daring this particular issue would be. On the cover, Cindy appeared in a black corset and stockings, her long hair flowing, makeup perfectly polished, her expression equal parts sultry and playful. Beside her sat Canadian singer K.D. Lang, openly lesbian and unapologetically androgynous, dressed in a man's suit and tie, exuding a cool defiance. The centerpiece of the image? Cindy, crouched close to Lang, holding a razor to her face in a mock shave, their proximity charged with intimacy. The image was electric. It wasn't just provocative, it was unprecedented. In an era when mainstream magazines rarely featured queer themes outside of scandalized news stories, here was one of the most famous supermodels in the world playfully shaving one of the most famous lesbian artists, presenting it not as a sideshow but as glamour, as art, as seduction. It was playful, cheeky, and transgressive all at once. The reaction was immediate. For some, it was shocking, an image that blurred the lines of gender, sexuality, and desire in a way that had rarely been seen on a magazine rack in every American grocery store. For others, it was thrilling, even liberating. The cover became a cultural lightning rod, sparking conversations not just about Cindy Crawford and K.D. Lang, but about the visibility of queer intimacy in mainstream culture. Of course, with shock came rumors. The tabloids pounced, speculating endlessly about whether the chemistry on the cover was more than just performance. Was Cindy experimenting with her sexuality? Was there a secret relationship between her and Lang? Neither woman had said anything publicly to spark such rumors, but the suggestive imagery was enough to keep gossip magazines spinning stories for months. For a media industry always hungry for scandal, it was a perfect storm, a straight supermodel and a queer pop star sharing a moment that blurred the line between art and reality. Both Cindy and K.D. Lang denied that there was any romance between them. For Cindy, the shoot was a playful artistic collaboration, one that reflected her willingness to push boundaries and have fun with her public persona. For Lang, it was an opportunity to bring her own identity into spaces that often excluded it. Neither, however, seemed particularly bothered by the speculation. In fact, Cindy later reflected on the shoot as one of her favorite covers, a reminder of the way fashion and art could provoke conversation and challenge norms. But beyond the rumors, what truly mattered was a cultural impact. The early 90s was still a time when LGBTQ+ representation in mainstream media was scarce and often tinged with stigma. Ellen DeGeneres wouldn't come out publicly until 1997, and same-sex intimacy on television was still considered shocking. Against that backdrop, the Vanity Fair cover was a seismic moment. It put queer imagery, playful, sexy, and unapologetic, on the same stage as the most glamorous depictions of heterosexual romance. It didn't just wink at the idea of two women together, it flaunted it, daring viewers to look away. For the LGBTQ+ community, the cover was both a validation and a provocation. Here was Cindy Crawford, the epitome of heterosexual desirability, engaging in imagery that challenged rigid boundaries. And here was K.D. Lang, refusing to conform to traditional femininity, proudly inhabiting her identity on one of the biggest stages possible. Together, they disrupted the narrative of what female beauty and desire could look like. Cindy's role in queer cultural history may not have been intentional, but it was undeniable. By lending her image to that moment, she became part of a broader cultural shift toward visibility. It was a reminder that icons could create space for representation even without fully realizing it. For Cindy, it was an experiment in artistry. For Lang, it was authenticity. For the culture, it was a revolution, subtle but unforgettable. In the years that followed, the rumors of a romance between Cindy and K.D. Lang faded, as both women moved forward with their careers. But the image itself remained, etched into the cultural memory of the 1990s. It continues to be celebrated as one of the most daring magazine covers ever published, a snapshot of a decade when boundaries were beginning to blur, and when fashion and music dared to confront questions of identity head-on. For Cindy Crawford, who was so often presented as the epitome of traditional heterosexual glamour, the cover offered a different narrative, one that made her more intriguing, more layered, and more enigmatic. Even if the romance rumors were unfounded, they added to the mythos of her secret love life, intertwining her with cultural movements that stretched beyond the world of fashion. In hindsight, the 1993 Vanity Fair cover wasn't just a playful gimmick. It was a landmark moment in the intersection of celebrity, sexuality, and media. And whether Cindy Crawford realized it or not, she had become part of LGBTQ+ history, her beauty mark forever inked on the face of queer visibility in mainstream culture. By the early 1990s, no celebrity commanded controversy the way Madonna did. She wasn't just a pop star. She was a cultural earthquake, shaking the foundations of music, sexuality, and morality itself. In 1992 alone, she released her infamous sex book, a glossy coffee table volume filled with explicit images that blurred the lines between art and pornography. That same year, she dropped the Erotica album, a sensual, unapologetic celebration of desire that courted outrage from conservatives and fascination from fans. Wherever Madonna went, scandal followed, but so did reinvention. She wasn't just performing music, she was performing culture itself. It was into this whirlwind that Cindy Crawford was drawn. At first glance, the pairing might have seemed unexpected. Madonna, the provocateur tearing down sexual taboos, and Cindy, the supermodel who represented glamorous perfection and wholesome appeal. But beneath the surface, their worlds weren't so far apart. Both women were icons, both masters of image-making, and both understood the intoxicating power of blurring the line between fantasy and reality. In the early 90s, Cindy and Madonna were spotted together often enough to spark curiosity. They attended parties, charity events, and industry functions, their appearances sending flashes of cameras into overdrive. For a media landscape hungry for intrigue, it was irresistible. If Cindy and Richard Gere had been Hollywood's golden couple, Cindy and Madonna were something more dangerous, a pairing that hinted at rebellion, seduction, and scandal. The rumors began almost immediately. Gossip columns speculated about whether the two were more than friends. After all, Madonna had a long history of playing with sexual boundaries. From her provocative stage performances to her very public same-sex kisses in photo shoots and music videos, she had made queerness a part of her public persona at a time when few dared to. To tabloids, it seemed only natural to wonder if Cindy Crawford had been pulled into Madonna's orbit in more ways than one. One incident in particular fanned the flames. In 1993, Cindy appeared on The Late Show with David Letterman and was introduced, in a moment of pure Madonna mischief, by none other than Madonna herself. The pop star didn't just walk Cindy onto the stage. She called her "my girlfriend" on live television, winking at the audience with her trademark smirk. The crowd roared, and headlines the next day were filled with speculation. Was Madonna joking? Was it a publicity stunt? Or was she revealing something more? Cindy never confirmed anything. In fact, her silence became part of the intrigue. Unlike Madonna, who leaned into controversy as part of her career, Cindy seemed content to let the rumors swirl without comment. She didn't deny, but she didn't embrace it either. Her silence allowed the public imagination to run wild, filling in the blanks with fantasies of secret liaisons and whispered scandals. For Madonna, the rumors were just another chapter in a career built on pushing boundaries. She thrived on being a cultural lightning rod, using every whisper of scandal to fuel her dominance. But for Cindy, the effect was different. The speculation transformed her image. No longer was she just a supermodel goddess, the Pepsi girl, the face of Revlon, the wholesome girl next door elevated to divine beauty. Now she was seen, at least in tabloid headlines, as a femme fatale, a woman whose allure was dangerous enough to entangle even Madonna. That transformation mattered. In the mythology of the 1990s, supermodels were already seen as larger-than-life figures. But by being linked to Madonna, Cindy crossed into a different realm. She became a part of the conversation about sexuality, identity, and rebellion. Even if she never intended to, she was now part of the cultural friction that Madonna embodied, the tension between respectability and desire, between mainstream acceptance and taboo. It's important to remember how explosive this was in its time. The early 90s was still an era when same-sex intimacy was seen as scandalous. Two of the most famous women in the world, one a supermodel, the other the queen of pop, to even be rumored as romantically linked was enough to send shockwaves through the culture. Whether or not there was any truth to it was almost irrelevant. The whisper was enough. For Madonna, the speculation reaffirmed her power to destabilize norms, to keep the world guessing about her true desires. For Cindy, the experience showed the double-edged sword of fame. She didn't have to do anything other than stand next to Madonna to become the subject of global gossip. But instead of fighting it, she allowed the rumors to wash over her, adding yet another layer to her mystique. Looking back now, the Cindy-Madonna connection seems less about whether there was a real romance and more about what their pairing symbolized. It was a collision of two cultural forces, one who defined beauty and one who defined controversy. Together, they represented both sides of the 90s coin, glamour and danger, allure and rebellion, fantasy and reality. And whether or not they ever shared more than friendship, Cindy Crawford's proximity to Madonna permanently altered her public image. She was no longer just a girl next door with a beauty mark. She was a woman of secrets, of rumors, of tantalizing possibilities that kept the tabloids guessing. In that sense, Madonna did for Cindy what no modeling campaign ever could. She made her dangerous. She made her mysterious. She turned her from supermodel to myth. Today, Cindy Crawford stands as one of those rare cultural figures whose influence has only deepened with time. Unlike many celebrities whose fame fades with the decades, Cindy's name remains synonymous with beauty, glamour, and a particular kind of 90s allure. She occasionally returns to the modeling world, often in carefully chosen campaigns that remind us why she was once the face of an entire generation. But her primary focus has shifted to her family, her businesses, and her role as a mentor, most visibly in supporting her daughter Rande Gerber's rise as one of the leading models of the 21st century. It is telling that Cindy no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. Her position as the original supermodel has been cemented in fashion history. The beauty mark above her lip, once considered too unconventional by early modeling agents, has become one of the most famous physical features in the world. Even in her 50s, she is celebrated not just for her looks but for her longevity, her ability to adapt, and a refusal to let gossip dictate the arc of her life. The decades of rumors, whispers, and speculation did not destroy Cindy Crawford. In a way, they made her larger than life. Every relationship, whether confirmed or imagined, added another layer to her mystique. Richard Gere gave her the aura of Hollywood royalty. Rande Gerber gave her stability and the chance to build a dynasty. Katie Lang gave her a brush with queer cultural history. Madonna tethered her name to one of pop culture's most provocative figures. Together, these stories formed a collage, some pieces true, some painted by tabloids, that ensured Cindy was never just another model. She was always a story, a legend people wanted to tell and retell. In reflecting on her career, Cindy herself has often been candid about the cost of fame. She has spoken about her youthful naivety during her marriage to Gere, about growing into her own identity, about understanding the difference between what the world wanted her to be and who she actually was. That honesty, sprinkled carefully across interviews and memoirs, has allowed her to reclaim the narrative in subtle ways. She acknowledges the past without wallowing in it, which makes her story resonate even more powerfully. What keeps Cindy Crawford fascinating, decades later, is not simply her beauty. Beauty alone, no matter how dazzling, fades from public memory without context. What keeps her alive in the cultural imagination is a combination of glamour, secrecy, and endurance. The gossip, while intrusive, gave her an edge of mystery. Her resilience in the face of it gave her depth. And her ability to transition from model to businesswoman, from cover girl to cultural matriarch, gave her staying power. There's also something timeless about the way Cindy's story reflects the dynamics of fame itself. She emerged during an era when celebrities had less control over their image, when paparazzi and tabloids dictated the public conversation. Yet she managed to survive that landscape with her dignity intact. Today, in a world where celebrities can use social media to bypass the rumor mill, Cindy's trajectory feels like a blueprint. Proof that sometimes silence and mystery are more powerful than constant explanation. When we circle back to the hook, the idea of secrets that could shake Hollywood, we realize that Cindy's story was never really about scandal at all. It was about the power of perception. The so-called secrets of her love life, whether real or imagined, were less important than the way they fed into a cultural narrative. Cindy Crawford didn't just live through the 90s gossip machine. She helped define it, even if unintentionally. Her name became shorthand for glamour tinged with intrigue, for the idea that beauty and mystery combined could capture the world's imagination. Her legacy, then, is not just as a supermodel, or as Richard Gere's ex-wife, or as Rande Gerber's partner, or as Kaya's mother. It is as a cultural icon who showed that beauty is only part of the story. The real fascination lies in what remains unsaid, in the secrets whispered about but never confirmed, in the way myth and reality dance together. Cindy Crawford's love life wasn't simply about romance. It was about power, about narrative, and about defining an era where the personal and the public collided in the brightest spotlight imaginable. From the whirlwind of Cindy Crawford's fairy-tale marriage to Richard Gere, to the grounded stability she found with Rande Gerber, her life has always unfolded like a Hollywood screenplay. Along the way, a single photograph with K.D. Lang turned into a cultural milestone, and a friendship with Madonna sparked rumors that tabloids could not resist. Each chapter of her love life, real or imagined, stitched together a narrative that kept her name on the world's lips. But what makes Cindy's story enduring isn't just a list of names. It's the way her private life blurred the line between fact and speculation. Richard Gere was her husband, yes, but he was also a symbol of the fantasy that even a small-town girl could marry Hollywood royalty. Rande Gerber was her partner, yes, but also the proof that love could outlast gossip and grow into a dynasty. The K.D. Lang photo shoot wasn't a romance, but it was a moment that cracked open mainstream depictions of queer intimacy. Madonna may never have been a lover, but the mere possibility made Cindy a character in one of pop culture's most provocative narratives. That's the brilliance and the burden of fame. The truth, as Cindy herself has often suggested, is less dramatic than the headlines. But the stories, the whispers, the rumors, the what ifs are what cement her place in cultural history. Sometimes the myth matters more than the reality. Sometimes the most unforgettable stories aren't about what really happened, but about what we believe could have happened. Cindy Crawford has outlasted the gossip machine. She remains iconic not because she corrected every rumor, but because she let the intrigue swirl around her while she kept moving forward, building a career, a family, and a legend. She reminds us that fame is not only about the spotlight, but also about the shadows that make the light so dazzling. So now the question turns to you. Out of all the chapters of Cindy's love life, the dazzling Gere marriage, the stability with Rande Gerber, the provocative K.D. Lang cover, or the whispers about Madonna, which one fascinates you most? Was it the real love stories, or the rumored ones that never left the pages of magazines? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's see which part of Cindy Crawford's secret love life still captures our imaginations the most.